The news arrived quietly at first, not through some dramatic family meeting or emotional announcement with cameras everywhere. Instead, it started with a simple phone call that slowly spread through the Brown family, one conversation at a time. And somehow, before anyone fully realized it, everything inside the family dynamic began shifting. Because babies have a strange way of changing relationships, not only between parents, but between everyone connected to them. That became painfully obvious the moment the family learned a new baby was on the way. At first, excitement filled the conversations naturally. Everyone smiled more. Old tensions temporarily softened. Family members who barely spoke lately suddenly started checking in with each other again. Even Kody noticed the difference immediately. For weeks, the emotional atmosphere around the family had felt heavy, filled with unresolved tension, emotional distance, and quiet exhaustion that nobody fully knew how to fix anymore. But now, there was anticipation again, hope, something new to focus on besides years of emotional strain. Still, underneath the excitement, deeper emotions quietly started surfacing too. Because while babies bring joy, they also force people to confront things they've been emotionally avoiding. And inside this family, there was plenty being avoided. The afternoon everyone officially gathered together to talk about the baby felt strangely emotional from the beginning. Janelle arrived first, calm but thoughtful as always. Christine followed soon after, carrying excitement openly in her expression. Mary seemed quieter, more reflective. Robin smiled warmly while trying to keep the atmosphere positive. And Kody? Kody looked overwhelmed before the conversation even began. Not unhappy, just emotional in a way he couldn't fully explain yet. As everyone settled into the living room, conversations overlapped naturally at first. Questions about names, timing, preparations, excitement about becoming grandparents again. For a little while, things felt almost normal, like older versions of the family before emotional fractures became impossible to ignore. Then something shifted. It happened during one simple moment when someone joked about how different family life would feel once the baby arrived. The room laughed softly, but Kody didn't. Instead, he stared quietly ahead for a second too long. Christine noticed immediately. "You okay?" she asked gently. Kody blinked, pulled back into the conversation. "Yeah," he answered softly. "Just thinking." Nobody pushed further, but internally, his emotions had already started moving somewhere deeper. Because suddenly, the idea of a new baby entering the family forced him to confront something he hadn't wanted to admit for years. The family itself had changed permanently. Children were growing up, relationships were evolving, people were emotionally separating in ways he still struggled accepting fully. And now this baby represented not only new beginnings, but undeniable proof that time was moving forward, whether the family was emotionally ready or not. Later that evening, after everyone else left, Kody sat quietly outside alone, replaying the gathering in his head. The excitement around the baby should have felt simple, happy, but instead it stirred complicated emotions inside him. Because babies don't only create beginnings, they also highlight endings. Endings of old family faces, old roles, old emotional dynamics. And suddenly Kody realized how much he missed the years when the family felt united by shared purpose instead of divided by emotional distance. Meanwhile, across town, Janelle reflected on the gathering differently. For her, the news about the baby felt hopeful, but also revealing, because she noticed how differently everyone emotionally reacted to the situation. Some people leaned toward excitement immediately, others toward nostalgia, others toward anxiety. And underneath all those reactions existed deeper truths about the current emotional state of the family itself. That's what babies do sometimes. They expose emotional realities people normally avoid discussing. The next morning, Christine called Janelle while organizing things around the house. "Did you notice how emotional Kody got yesterday?" Christine asked carefully. Janelle sighed softly. "Yeah, I noticed." Christine paused before continuing. "I don't think this is only about the baby." Janelle understood immediately. Because deep down, everyone sensed the same thing. The baby wasn't creating emotional tension. It was revealing tension already there. Kody's reaction carried grief underneath it. Grief for how much the family changed. Grief for emotional closeness that once existed more naturally. Grief for time itself moving faster than he emotionally knew how to handle. Later that afternoon, while looking through old family photos unexpectedly, Kody found himself overwhelmed by memories. Years ago, babies meant something different inside the family. Back then, every birth brought everyone together emotionally. The family felt connected by shared responsibility, shared excitement, shared identity. Now, things felt more fragmented.
Still loving, still connected in some ways, but different. And Kody struggled knowing exactly how to process that difference emotionally. At one point, he stopped on a photo of the family from years earlier, all the children younger, everyone crowded together, chaos and laughter filling the room naturally. For a moment, he smiled genuinely. Then the sadness followed immediately afterward. Because so much had changed since those years. Not only the children, the relationships too. The emotional closeness that once felt automatic inside the family now required effort, caution, and intentionality. And Kody quietly feared that maybe some of that closeness would never fully return. Meanwhile, Janelle noticed the emotional atmosphere changing around everyone too. The baby became more than happy news. It became an emotional mirror. People projected different feelings on it depending on what they themselves were emotionally struggling with. For Christine, the baby represented hope and renewal. For Mary, it seemed tied to reflection and emotional distance. For Robin, it created a strong desire to emotionally reconnect the family again. And for Kody, the baby represented both joy and grief simultaneously. Janelle recognized that immediately. One evening, during another family dinner, the emotional tension surfaced more openly than before. Everyone gathered around discussing future family plans involving the baby. At first, the conversation remained lighthearted. Then one of the older children joked casually, "Things really don't feel like the old days anymore." The room immediately grew quieter. Nobody reacted dramatically, but everyone felt the emotional truth underneath the statement. Kody looked down at the table silently. Christine tried softening the moment with a smile. Well, families evolve, but even she sounded uncertain. Because evolution and loss sometimes feel emotionally similar. The older child continued gently. "I didn't mean it in a bad way. Just different. Different." That word had quietly become the emotional theme of the family lately. Not completely broken, not completely healed. Just different from what everyone once imagined the future would look like. Later that night, after the gathering ended, Kody remained sitting alone at the table long after everyone else left. The comment kept replaying in his head. Things don't feel like the old days anymore. Because deep down, he knew that was true. And perhaps the hardest part wasn't losing the past itself. It was realizing no amount of wishing could bring it back exactly the same. The next morning, Christine visited Janelle while discussing plans surrounding the baby. At first, the conversation stayed practical. Then Christine quietly admitted something deeper. "I think the baby is making everyone emotional because it reminds us how much time has passed." Janelle nodded immediately. "Yeah, I think so too." Christine sat back thoughtfully. "It's weird. New life should feel simple and happy. But somehow it's bringing up grief too. Again, grief. That emotion kept appearing beneath nearly every family interactions lately. Not grief caused by tragedy exactly. Grief caused by transition. People mourning older versions of the family while simultaneously trying to embrace what the family was becoming now." Janelle sighed softly. "I think everybody imagined the future differently years ago." Christine looked toward her carefully. "And now?" Janelle hesitated before answering honestly. "Now we're all adjusting to reality instead of expectations." That truth carried emotional weight, because expectations shaped so much of the family's earlier identity. The belief that closeness would always remain strong. The belief that the family structure itself would emotionally protect everyone. The belief that shared love alone could prevent emotional fragmentation over time. Now those beliefs felt far more complicated. Later that afternoon, Kody sat privately with Robin discussing the growing emotional atmosphere inside the family. Robin noticed immediately how reflective he had become lately. "You've been really emotional about the baby," she observed gently. Kody exhaled slowly. "I don't think it's only about the baby." Robin nodded carefully. "I know." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Kody finally admitted something vulnerable. "I think I'm realizing how much of the family I've been trying to hold on to emotionally." The honesty in his voice sounded heavy now, because the baby represented undeniable forward movement. Children becoming adults, new generations beginning, old dynamics changing permanently. And part of Kody still emotionally resisted accepting how different the family had become from its earlier years. Robin answered softly. "You can't stop families from changing." Kody stared quietly ahead. "Yeah," he whispered, "but sometimes change feels a lot like loss." The sentence lingered heavily between them, because that was exactly what he was struggling with emotionally. Not hatred toward change. Fear of emotional disappearance. Fear that the closeness, unity, and shared identity he once built his entire life around might slowly fade into memory. That evening, another conversation unexpectedly deepened the emotional tension surrounding the baby even further. During a casual discussion about future holidays, someone asked whether the family would still gather the same way once the baby arrived. The room fell into uncomfortable silence again, because underneath the simple question existed something much larger. Would the family still function emotionally as one connected unit moving forward? Or were they already becoming separate pieces trying to preserve connection from a distance? Janelle noticed Kody's expression tighten immediately. He looked emotionally overwhelmed again, and suddenly she understood something important. The baby itself wasn't frightening him. What frightened him was what the baby symbolized. Time moving forward, children building independent lives, the family evolving beyond the emotional structure he spent decades trying to maintain. Later that night, after everyone left, Kody sat quietly reflecting on everything unfolding lately. And for the first time, she realized the baby wasn't only reshaping relationships because of joy or excitement. It was forcing every member of the family to confront one painful truth. Nothing stays emotionally frozen forever. Not children, not relationships, not families. And maybe the real challenge wasn't preserving the past. Maybe it was learning how to love each other through change without losing connection completely.
That realization lingered heavily over the family during the next several days. Nobody openly discussed it directly, but everyone felt it. The baby had become more than exciting news. It had become a reminder that the family was entering a completely different chapter of life, one none of them fully knew how to navigate emotionally. For years, the Brown family identity centered around raising children together, building a shared household, surviving chaos as one large connected unit. That structure gave everyone purpose, routines, and emotional direction. But now, the children were adults. Relationships had shifted. Emotional distance existed where closeness once felt effortless. And the baby represented something strange emotionally. A new beginning happening at the same time an older family era quietly ended. One afternoon, Janelle sat with Christine, helping organize gifts and baby supplies while soft music played quietly in the background. At first, the conversation stayed light. Then Christine suddenly smiled sadly while folding tiny baby clothes. "Can you believe we used to live in nonstop chaos like this all the time?" Janelle laughed softly. Honestly, barely. For a moment, both smiled at the memories. Then Christine's expression grew more emotional. "I miss parts of it sometimes." The confession carried more weight than the words themselves, because everyone missed parts of the past lately. Even people who knew the family had major struggles still mourned certain forms of closeness that existed years ago. Janelle nodded slowly. "Me too." Christine looked toward her carefully. "It's weird though, right? Missing things while also knowing you couldn't go back to living exactly that way again." That contradiction perfectly described the emotional state of the family lately. Nostalgia mixed with realism, love mixed with exhaustion, gratitude mixed with grief. Janelle sighed softly. "I think people always imagine they'll recognize major life transitions while they're happening." Christine frowned thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" I don't think any of us realized certain phases of this family were ending until they were already gone." The honesty in her voice settled quietly between them, because it was true. Nobody fully notices emotional eras ending while living inside them. One day routines simply feel normal, and years later people suddenly realize those moments disappeared without warning. Meanwhile, across town, Kody continued struggling emotionally more than anyone realized publicly. The baby stirred emotions he hadn't fully confronted in years. Regret, nostalgia, fear, loneliness, and underneath everything, an overwhelming sense that time itself was moving faster than he emotionally knew how to process. That afternoon, while looking through old home videos alone, he found himself completely absorbed in memories. Children laughing loudly, crowded birthday parties, late-night chaos, family trips, moments where everyone still seemed emotionally connected despite the challenges. At one point, he paused the video and stared quietly at the frozen screen. The room suddenly felt painfully silent compared to the life inside those memories. And for the first time, he admitted something honestly to himself. Part of him feared the family would never emotionally feel that connected again. Later that evening, during another family gathering, the emotional undercurrent surfaced more openly once again. Everyone sat together discussing plans surrounding the baby, when one simple question unexpectedly shifted the atmosphere. "Do you think this baby will bring the family closer again?" Silence. Immediate silence. Nobody answered right away because everyone understood the emotional complexity hiding underneath the question. Finally, Robin spoke gently. "I think babies remind people what matters." The response sounded hopeful, but not fully convincing. Christine looked down thoughtfully. "Maybe," she said softly, "but babies can't fix emotional distance by themselves." Again, honesty entered the room, painfully honest, because the family had spent years quietly hoping milestones, celebrations, holidays, or emotional moments would somehow automatically repair deeper fractures. But emotional healing rarely works that way. Janelle finally added quietly, "I think the baby is revealing where everybody emotionally stands more than changing it." The statement immediately settled heavily across the room, because deep down, everyone knew she was right. The excitement surrounding the baby exposed emotional truths already existing beneath the surface. Who still felt connected? Who felt emotionally distant? Who longed for closeness again? Who feared losing the family completely? Kody stared silently ahead after hearing her words, and suddenly he realized something difficult. The family had spent years trying to preserve togetherness externally, while emotionally drifting apart internally. That realization hurt more than he expected.
Later that night, after everyone left, Mary remained behind briefly helping clean up. At one point, she quietly looked toward Kody. "You're taking all of this really hard emotionally." Kody sighed deeply. "I didn't realize how much I was still emotionally attached to what the family used to be." Mary nodded softly. "I think everybody is." Again, there was that shared grief. Not necessarily grief over love disappearing, grief over transformation itself. People rarely mourn only relationships. Sometimes they mourn identities, roles, versions of themselves connected to certain family phases that no longer exist anymore. Kody rubbed his forehead tiredly. "I just always thought we'd stay emotionally closer no matter what changed." Mary answered carefully. "Families don't stop loving each other when they change, but sometimes they have to relearn how to stay connected differently." The sentence stayed with him long after she left. Because maybe that was the real challenge now. Not recreating the past, learning how to emotionally exist inside a completely different version of the family without losing connection entirely. The next morning, Janelle sat alone reflecting on the same thing. The baby had emotionally awakened something inside everyone. Not only joy, awareness. People were finally confronting truths they quietly avoided for years. The family had changed permanently. The old structure no longer existed the same way, and pretending otherwise only created more emotional tension. Still, despite all the sadness and uncertainty lately, Janelle noticed something hopeful too. The baby was also making people emotionally honest again. Conversations felt deeper, less performative, less emotionally guarded. Maybe because new life naturally forces people to examine what truly matters beneath old conflicts and emotional pride. And perhaps that honesty, painful as it sometimes felt, was exactly what the family needed most right now. Over the next several weeks, the emotional atmosphere surrounding the family continued evolving in ways nobody fully expected. At first, everyone assumed the excitement about the baby would eventually settle into normal routines again. But instead, the closer the birth became, the more emotionally reflective the entire family seemed to grow. Conversations deepened. Old memories resurfaced constantly. People who normally kept emotional distance suddenly found themselves reaching out more often. And beneath it all existed a quiet awareness that this baby represented far more than another addition to the family. It represented transition. One evening during dinner at Christine's house, the emotional shift became especially obvious. The family sat together discussing baby preparations, while laughter occasionally filled the room. For a little while, the atmosphere felt warm and familiar again. Then one of the younger family members casually asked, "What was it like when all of us were little?" The question instantly transformed the conversation. Everyone started sharing stories at once. Chaotic mornings, late-night emergencies, crowded holidays, road trips filled with noise and stress and laughter. For several minutes, the family sounded emotionally connected in a way they hadn't in years. Even Kody smiled more naturally while telling old stories. But then something changed. As the memories continued, the emotional warmth slowly became mixed with sadness. Because everyone realized those years were gone now. Not temporarily, permanently. Janelle noticed it first in Kody's face. The smile remained, but emotion lingered underneath it now. And suddenly she understood something clearly. The baby wasn't only bringing hope into the family. It was forcing everyone to emotionally revisit what they lost along the way too. Later that evening, after most people left, Christine quietly sat beside Janelle outside. "You felt it too tonight, didn't you?" Christine asked softly. Janelle nodded immediately. "Yeah." Christine stared quietly toward the dark yard ahead of them. "It's like everybody's grieving something lately." Again, grief. The emotion continued surfacing in nearly every meaningful interaction surrounding the baby. But now the grief felt more specific somehow. People weren't grieving the baby. They were grieving time. The realization that family phases disappear quietly while people are busy living them. Janelle sighed softly. "I think the baby is reminding everybody how fast life changed." Christine looked down thoughtfully. "And maybe how much we didn't emotionally process while everything was changing." That observation landed deeply. Because for years, the family focused heavily on surviving practical challenges. Moves, relationships, responsibilities, emotional conflict, public pressure. But emotional processing? That often came last. And now suddenly, years of unresolved feelings seemed to be surfacing all at once through the emotional symbolism surrounding the baby. Meanwhile, Kody continued wrestling privately with emotions he barely understood himself. One afternoon, while driving alone, he found himself completely absorbed in memories. Children laughing loudly, crowded birthday parties, late-night chaos, family trips, moments where everyone still seemed emotionally connected despite the challenges. At one point, he paused the video and stared quietly at the frozen screen. The room suddenly felt painfully silent compared to the life inside those memories. And for the first time, he admitted something honestly to himself. Part of him feared the family would never emotionally feel that connected again. Later that evening, during another family gathering, the emotional undercurrent surfaced more openly once again. Everyone sat together discussing plans surrounding the baby, when one simple question unexpectedly shifted the atmosphere. "Do you think this baby will bring the family closer again?" Silence. Immediate silence. Nobody answered right away because everyone understood the emotional complexity hiding underneath the question. Finally, Robin spoke gently. "I think babies remind people what matters." The response sounded hopeful, but not fully convincing. Christine looked down thoughtfully. "Maybe," she said softly, "but babies can't fix emotional distance by themselves." Again, honesty entered the room. Painfully honest. Because the family had spent years quietly hoping milestones, celebrations, holidays, or emotional moments would somehow automatically repair deeper fractures. But emotional healing rarely works that way. Janelle finally added quietly, I think the baby is revealing where everybody emotionally stands more than changing it. The statement immediately settled heavily across the room. Because deep down, everyone knew she was right. The excitement surrounding the baby exposed emotional truths already existing beneath the surface. Who still felt connected? Who felt emotionally distant? Who longed for closeness again? Who feared losing the family completely? Kody stared silently ahead after hearing her words. And suddenly he realized something difficult. The family had spent years trying to preserve togetherness externally, while emotionally drifting apart internally. That realization hurt more than he expected. Later that night, after everyone left, Mary remained behind briefly helping clean up. At one point, she quietly looked toward Kody. You're taking all of this really hard emotionally. Kody sighed deeply. I didn't realize how much I was still emotionally attached to what the family used to be. Mary nodded softly. I think everybody is. Again, there was that shared grief.
That quiet shift toward acceptance began changing the emotional atmosphere inside the family more noticeably over the next several days. Not because everyone suddenly resolved their problems, but because people slowly stopped resisting the reality that change had already happened. And strangely, once the resistance softened, conversations started feeling more honest, more open, more emotionally real. One afternoon, while preparing meals together before another family gathering, Christine noticed something unusual. People were actually listening to each other again, not simply waiting to speak. Listening. Even small interactions carried more emotional awareness lately. Family members checked in on one another more naturally. Old tension still existed, but it no longer controlled every room the same way. The approaching birth seemed to be reminding everyone how temporary life phases truly are. And suddenly, emotional pride felt less important than connection. Meanwhile, Kody continued wrestling privately with complicated emotions surrounding his place inside the family. But now, instead of only grieving what had changed, he began noticing something else too. The family still wanted him present emotionally. Maybe not in the exact same role as before, maybe not as the emotional center of everything anymore, but still present, still valued, still loved in ways he hadn't fully allowed himself to recognize lately. That realization hit unexpectedly during a quiet conversation with one of the older children. They sat outside discussing plans for the baby when the conversation turned emotional naturally. At one point, the child looked toward Kody and smiled softly. You know, even though everything's different now, you're still Dad. That part doesn't disappear. The words nearly broke him emotionally, because underneath all his fear surrounding change existed one deeper fear he rarely admitted aloud. That emotional distance meant emotional replacement. That if the family structure evolved enough, eventually people would stop needing him entirely. Now, hearing those words, he realized something important. Roles evolve, relationships evolve, but emotional significance doesn't automatically disappear simply because life changes shape. Later that evening, the family gathered again for another casual dinner before the baby's arrival. This time, the emotional atmosphere felt calmer somehow. Still reflective, still emotional, but lighter than previous gatherings. At one point, laughter filled the room loudly after someone shared an embarrassing old family story involving one disastrous road trip years earlier. Everyone laughed, including Kody. Real laughter this time, not forced politeness hiding emotional heaviness underneath. And for a brief moment, the family felt emotionally connected again in a way nobody had experienced for a long time. Janelle noticed it immediately. The softness, the ease, the absence of emotional defensiveness for once. As she quietly looked around the room, she realized something surprising. Maybe the family didn't need to return to the past in order to reconnect emotionally. Maybe they simply needed to stop comparing the present to older versions of themselves constantly. That realization stayed with her long after dinner ended. Later that night, while helping clean up, Mary quietly admitted something that surprised everyone nearby. I spent a long time believing change automatically meant loss. Christine looked toward her thoughtfully. And now? Mary paused before answering honestly. Now I think change only becomes loss when people stop emotionally showing up for each other. The statement settled heavily across the kitchen, because emotional presence had become the central issue underneath everything lately. Not perfection, not agreement. Presence. Who still showed up emotionally despite discomfort? Who still tried listening?
Who still cared enough to remain vulnerable through change instead of emotionally disappearing from each other? Kody looked down quietly after hearing her words, because lately he had started realizing how often emotional absence, not physical absence, damaged relationships most deeply inside the family. Years of emotional exhaustion made everyone gradually withdraw in different ways. Some became quieter. Some became defensive. Some emotionally detached completely. And now the baby was forcing everyone to confront whether those emotional patterns could continue if the family hoped to stay connected moving forward. The next morning, Janelle sat alone reflecting on everything happening lately. For the first time in years, she noticed something hopeful inside herself too. Not false optimism. Realistic hope. The family still carried unresolved pain. Still complicated dynamics. Still emotional scars that wouldn't disappear overnight. But underneath all of that, people were finally acknowledging their feelings honestly again. And honesty changes relationships. Not instantly, but deeply. One afternoon, while preparing the nursery space together, Robin quietly asked Janelle something emotional. "Do you think the family can actually grow closer again after all this?" Janelle thought carefully before answering. "I don't think we'll ever go backward emotionally." Robin nodded slowly. "But maybe we don't need to," Janelle continued softly. "Maybe we just need to learn how to stay connected differently now." That idea lingered between them, because perhaps that was the real emotional lesson slowly emerging from everything surrounding the baby. The family wasn't failing because it changed. It struggled because everyone spent too long mourning old versions of connection instead of building new ones. That evening, another emotional moment unexpectedly shifted the atmosphere even further. During a quiet conversation about future traditions once the baby arrived, someone suggested creating entirely new family gatherings instead of constantly trying to recreate older ones. The idea sounded simple, but emotionally it mattered enormously, because it represented acceptance. Acceptance that the family's future would not look identical to its past. And maybe that was okay. Christine smiled warmly. "I actually love that idea." Others slowly agreed too. For the first time, conversations about the future felt less rooted in grief and more rooted in possibility. Not because the pain disappeared, because people finally stopped treating change itself like emotional failure. Later that night, Kody sat outside once again watching lights glow softly through the windows while family voices drifted through the house. Only this time, the emotions inside him felt different. The sadness remained. The nostalgia remained. But alongside them existed something new. Peace. Not complete peace, but the beginning of emotional acceptance that families survive not by remaining frozen in one version of themselves forever, but by continuing to choose connection through every stage of transformation. The closer the due date came, the more the family's emotional energy shifted away from fear and toward anticipation. Not just anticipation for the baby itself, anticipation for what the family might become afterward. That realization surprised everyone. For weeks, the conversation surrounding the baby had been filled with nostalgia, grief, emotional reflection, and uncertainty about the future. But now, something softer and steadier slowly replaced some of that heaviness. People were beginning to accept that the family didn't need to look exactly like the past in order to still matter deeply. And once that understanding settled emotionally, relationships started breathing again. One afternoon, Christine stood in the kitchen preparing food while laughter echoed through the house from another room. Several family members had gathered together casually to help finish last-minute preparations before the baby arrived. At one point, Christine paused and simply listened. The sound of conversation. The sound of people emotionally present together. The sound of warmth returning naturally instead of being forced. It hit her harder than expected. Because for a long time, family gatherings often felt emotionally careful. Everyone seemed guarded, exhausted, or quietly disconnected beneath polite interactions. But lately, something had changed. Not perfection, presence. People were showing up emotionally again. Meanwhile, Kody found himself reflecting differently now too. The grief surrounding change still existed inside him, but it no longer completely controlled his emotions. Slowly, he started understanding something important. The family hadn't disappeared. It had evolved. And maybe part of his pain came from spending too much time comparing the present to an idealized version of the past, instead of appreciating what still existed now. That realization softened him emotionally. One evening during another family dinner, the emotional atmosphere became unexpectedly meaningful again. The conversation turned toward future memories the baby would someday have growing up around a family. Someone joked about how chaotic holidays would become again once toys and baby noise returned to gatherings. Everyone laughed. Then one of the older children smiled softly and said, "You know, this baby's going to grow up hearing stories about all of us." The room instantly quieted. But this time the silence didn't feel painful. It felt emotional in a different way. Because suddenly everyone realized something deeper. The family story was still continuing. Different chapters now. Different dynamics now. But still continuing. Janelle looked around the room carefully while everyone sat quietly reflecting. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel people mourning the family anymore. She felt people reconnecting to it. That difference mattered enormously. Later that evening, after most people left, Kody remained behind helping clean up once again. While quietly stacking dishes beside Janelle, he suddenly admitted something honestly. I think I spent too much time believing change meant we were losing the family. Janelle looked toward him thoughtfully. And now? Kody exhaled slowly. Now I think maybe we were just afraid to learn how to be a different version of a family. The honesty in his voice carried emotional maturity that hadn't existed in many conversations before. Janelle nodded softly. I think everybody was afraid of that. Because families often attach emotional safety to familiarity. When structures change, people panic emotionally, even when love itself still exists underneath everything. The next morning brought another emotional moment nobody fully expected. While organizing gifts and baby supplies together, several family members started sharing old stories when the children were younger again. But unlike previous conversations, this time the memories didn't feel heavy with grief. Instead, they felt grounding, comforting, proof that even though time changes people, the love inside those memories still mattered. At one point, Mary smiled quietly while holding a tiny baby blanket. It's strange, she admitted softly. For a while I thought we were losing each other completely. Christine looked toward her carefully. And now? Mary smiled faintly. Now I think we just forgot how to emotionally grow together. That sentence lingered deeply, because emotional growth had become the central lesson hidden underneath everything lately. The family struggled not because change happened. The family struggled because nobody knew how to emotionally adapt to change together. Now, slowly, they were learning. One conversation at a time. One honest moment at a time. One emotionally vulnerable interaction at a time.
Christine's words stayed with everyone longer than they expected. Maybe it's showing us what still continues. At first, the sentence sounded simple, hopeful, comforting. But over the following days, the family slowly began realizing how true it actually was. Because despite all the emotional distance, shifting relationships, and unresolved pain that had developed over the years, one thing remained undeniable. The family still continued finding its way back to each other during important moments. And somehow, the approaching birth was becoming one of those moments. Not perfectly, not without tension, but genuinely. One afternoon, Janelle sat quietly looking through old family photos while preparing decorations for an upcoming baby celebration. The pictures stretched across decades of memories. Tiny children sitting on crowded couches, birthday parties filled with chaos, holiday dinners packed with noise and laughter, road trips, camping trips, ordinary moments nobody realized would someday feel emotionally priceless. As she flipped through the photos slowly, something unexpected happened. Instead of only feeling sadness about how much had changed, she also started noticing something else. Connection had survived more than she thought. Yes, the family looked different now, more separate, more emotionally complicated. But love still appeared everywhere inside those memories. And even now, despite everything, pieces of that love still existed underneath the tension. That realization softened something inside her. Meanwhile, Kody continued emotionally struggling in quieter ways. The closer the birth became, the more reflective he grew. Every conversation about the future somehow led him back toward memories of the past. One evening, while sitting outside alone, he admitted something difficult to himself. Part of his sadness wasn't only about the family changing. It was about realizing how much time he lost emotionally disconnected from people he still deeply loved. That truth hurt more than nostalgia itself. Because nostalgia focuses on the past. Regret focuses on missed emotional opportunities.
and lately regret had become impossible for him to ignore. The next day, during another family gathering to prepare for the baby, emotional tensions surfaced again unexpectedly. At first, the atmosphere felt warm. Everyone moved around helping organize food, decorations, and gifts. Conversations overlapped naturally. For a little while, things almost resembled older family gatherings again. Then one small disagreement suddenly shifted the mood. It wasn't even serious, just conflicting opinions about plans surrounding the birth. But the emotional reaction underneath it revealed something deeper immediately. Old frustrations still existed. Old communication wounds still lingered. And suddenly the room felt emotionally fragile again. Kody noticed it instantly. The tension, the careful silence afterward, the way everyone emotionally pulled back slightly. Years ago, moments like this would often escalate quickly. Now, something different happened. Instead of arguing, people paused. Christine finally spoke softly. "Okay, I think everybody's emotions are just running high lately." The honesty helped diffuse the tension immediately. Because she was right. The baby had emotionally opened doors people kept closed for years. Old grief, old regret, old fears about family disconnection. Everything sat much closer to the surface now. Janelle quietly added, "I think we're all feeling more than we expected." Again, silence followed, but softer this time. Understanding silence, not defensive silence. Robin looked around the room carefully. Maybe that's not a bad thing. At first, nobody answered. Then Mary nodded slowly. "I think we got so used to avoiding difficult emotions that we stopped really talking honestly." The statement settled heavily over everyone. Because emotional avoidance had shaped the family for years. People protected themselves by staying busy, staying polite, staying emotionally careful. But underneath that carefulness, emotional distance quietly grew. Now, the baby was forcing honesty back into the family, whether anyone fully felt ready or not. Later that evening, after most people left, Kody remained behind helping clean up. Janelle noticed how emotionally quiet he seemed again. "You okay?" she asked gently. Kody leaned against the kitchen counter slowly. "I think this whole situation is making me realize how much emotional stuff we never fully dealt with." Janelle nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah." He looked toward her carefully. "I spent years trying to keep the family functioning structurally, but emotionally, I think I ignored a lot." The vulnerability in his voice sounded real. And for the first time in years, Janelle didn't hear defensiveness underneath his honesty. Only exhaustion, regret, self-awareness. She answered softly, "I think everybody ignored things emotionally because survival became the priority." Again, survival. That word continued defining so much of the family's emotional history. People became so focused on managing responsibilities, conflict, logistics, and constant pressure that emotional connection slowly weakened underneath everything else. Kody stared quietly ahead. And now the baby's making everybody stop and actually feel things again. Janelle gave a small, sad smile. "Pretty much." The truth felt strangely healing despite the discomfort surrounding it. Because families cannot emotionally reconnect while pretending nothing hurts. Honesty hurts first. Healing comes later. The next morning, Christine met with several family members to continue preparing for the birth. As conversations unfolded, she noticed something important. People were interacting differently now. More carefully. More intentionally. There was still tension sometimes, but underneath it existed a growing emotional awareness. Almost like everyone suddenly understood how fragile family connection could become if neglected too long. At one point, Christine quietly watched Kody speaking with one of the older children. The conversation seemed simple, but emotionally present in a way she hadn't seen from him in years. He listened more carefully now, paused more often, reacted more thoughtfully. And suddenly Christine realized the baby wasn't only reshaping relationships emotionally, it was reshaping priorities too. People were slowing down enough to recognize what truly mattered again. Later that afternoon, Mary admitted something during another conversation that surprised everyone. "I think this baby might actually help the family emotionally." Janelle looked toward her curiously. "How?" Mary hesitated before answering honestly. "Because for the first time in years, everybody's finally talking about what they actually feel." The room grew quiet again. Because she was right. The emotional walls between people hadn't disappeared completely, but cracks had started forming. Real conversations were happening again. Not only about the baby, about loneliness, change, fear, love, regret, connection. And perhaps those conversations mattered more than anybody realized yet. That evening, as the sun slowly disappeared outside the windows, the family gathered together once again. The atmosphere remained emotionally complicated, still uncertain, still fragile. But something undeniably softer existed now too. Not perfect unity, not complete healing, just willingness. Willingness to emotionally show up again. Willingness to listen again. Willingness to love each other through change instead of resisting it completely. And maybe quietly, that was exactly how relationships began reshaping themselves after years of emotional distance. As the days moved closer to the baby's arrival, the emotional energy surrounding the family became impossible to separate from the deeper issues everyone had been quietly carrying for years. What surprised the most was how naturally those hidden emotions kept surfacing. Not through explosive arguments, through small moments. Simple conversations suddenly turning emotional. Old memories triggering unexpected sadness. Ordinary family gatherings carrying emotional weight nobody fully anticipated. And slowly, everyone began realizing the same thing. The baby wasn't creating emotional change alone. The baby was exposing how much change had already happened. One afternoon, Kody sat with several of the older children discussing plans for future visits once the baby arrived. At first, the conversation stayed lighthearted, full of jokes about sleepless nights and family chaos returning again. Then one of the children laughed softly and said, "It's weird seeing the family grow while also feeling so different from how it used to." Again, there was that word, different.
As the final days before the birth approached, the emotional atmosphere inside the family continued transforming in subtle but undeniable ways. The tension that once dominated nearly every gathering no longer felt as heavy. Difficult emotions still existed, but now they were being acknowledged instead of quietly buried beneath awkward politeness or emotional avoidance. And somehow, that honesty itself was bringing people closer again. One evening, while everyone gathered together for dinner, Janelle noticed something that would have seemed impossible only a few months earlier. People looked comfortable around each other again. Not perfectly relaxed, not free from history or unresolved emotions, but emotionally present. Listening. Laughing naturally. Checking in with one another sincerely instead of mechanically. The difference felt enormous. At one point during the meal, conversation turned toward future family traditions once the baby arrived. Ideas started flowing naturally. Holiday gatherings, birthday routines, family trips, new memories everyone hoped to create together. And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't sound emotionally frightening. It sounded possible. That realization hit Kody especially hard. Because for years, he secretly feared the family's future would consist mostly of emotional separation and distance growing larger over time. Now, sitting there listening to everyone talk about the future together again, he realized something important. Connection had weakened, but it hadn't disappeared.
And maybe it never fully would as long as people continued choosing each other emotionally. Later that evening, after most people left, Christine remained behind helping clean up. While drying dishes quietly beside Kody, she smiled softly. "You seem lighter lately." Kody paused before answering. "I think I finally stopped fighting reality." Christine looked toward him curiously. "What do you mean?" He leaned against the counter slowly. "I kept trying to emotionally hold on to what the family used to be instead of appreciating what it still is." The honesty in his voice sounded calm now, less overwhelmed, less fearful. Christine nodded thoughtfully. "That's hard for a lot of people." Kody smiled faintly. "Yeah, but I think the baby forced all of us to look at things honestly. Again, honesty." That word kept appearing because honesty had quietly become the emotional turning point for everyone. The baby brought emotions to the surface people could no longer avoid. And once those emotions surfaced, the family finally started dealing with realities they had emotionally ignored for years. The next morning, Janelle sat outside alone with coffee, reflecting on everything that had changed recently. Only weeks earlier, the family felt emotionally exhausted and fragmented. Now, the problems still existed, but people no longer seemed emotionally disconnected from each other in the same way. And maybe that mattered more than perfect harmony ever could. One thing had become clear to her lately. Families survive difficult seasons not because conflict disappears, but because people decide the relationship matters enough to keep emotionally trying anyway. Later that evening, another emotional conversation unfolded unexpectedly during a small gathering. Someone asked whether everybody thought the baby would permanently change the family dynamic moving forward. This time, instead of uncomfortable silence, thoughtful answers came naturally. Christine smiled softly. "I think the baby already changed us." Everyone looked toward her. She continued gently. "Not because of the birth itself, because it made us slow down emotionally long enough to see each other again." The statement settled over the room quietly. And deep down, everyone knew it was true. For years, life moved too fast emotionally. People reacted instead of reflected, survived instead of connected, avoided instead of communicated. Now, the baby had interrupted that emotional momentum long enough for everyone to finally examine what mattered most, beneath the stress and distance. Mary nodded thoughtfully. "I don't think we realized how emotionally disconnected we'd become until we were forced to stop and really look at it." Again, another painful truth openly acknowledged. But now the honesty no longer felt destructive. It felt healing, because finally people were speaking from vulnerability instead of emotional protection. Kody sat quietly listening to everyone. And for the first time in years, he no longer felt like emotional reconnection inside the family was impossible. Complicated? Absolutely. Fragile? Definitely. But impossible? No. That evening, after everyone left once again, Kody remained outside alone watching the sky darken slowly. The air felt calm. Still. And for the first time in a very long while, his thoughts about the family no longer centered only around loss. Instead, he thought about continuity. The family story continuing through new generations. Through change. Through emotional growth. Through people learning how to reconnect differently than before. And suddenly, the baby no longer symbolized the end of an older family era emotionally. Instead, it symbolized transition into something new. Not identical to the past, but still meaningful. Still connected. Still alive. Inside the house, Janelle quietly watched through the window again, while family voices echoed softly in the background. And suddenly she realized something deeply emotional. For years, everyone feared change because they assumed change automatically meant emotional separation. But now she finally understood the truth. Change itself was never the real danger. Emotional withdrawal was. The family didn't begin healing because the baby magically solved their problems. The family began healing because people stopped emotionally retreating from one another. They started showing up again. Listening again. Trying again. And maybe, in the end, relationships are reshaped not because dramatic moments alone, but by the quiet decision to remain emotionally present through every difficult stage of life together. The night before the baby arrived, the family gathered together once more. The atmosphere felt different from every gathering before it. Not because all the problems disappeared, because something inside everyone had softened. Weeks earlier, conversations carried tension, grief, emotional uncertainty, and fear about what the family was becoming. But now, as everyone sat together, sharing food, stories, and quiet laughter, there was a deeper sense of emotional acceptance in the room. The family had changed. That truth no longer felt terrifying. It simply felt real. And somehow, reality felt less painful once people stopped resisting it emotionally. Janelle quietly watched everyone interact around the room. Christine laughing while telling old family stories. Mary smiling more naturally than she had in months. Robin moving through the kitchen helping organize things while gently checking on everyone emotionally. Kody sitting surrounded by conversation instead of emotionally isolated from it. The sight affected her more than expected. Because for a long time, she honestly feared the family would slowly drift so far apart emotionally that gatherings like this would eventually disappear altogether. Now she realized something important. The family was not disappearing. It was evolving. Messily. Painfully. Imperfectly. But genuinely. Later that evening, after most conversations settled into quieter moments, one of the younger family members suddenly asked, "Do you think this baby will remember how complicated everything was before they were born?" The question caught everyone off guard. For a moment, silence settled gently across the room. Then Christine smiled softly. "No," she answered quietly. "I think they'll remember how loved they were." The simplicity of the response nearly overwhelmed everyone emotionally. Because underneath all the years of tension, emotional distance, change, and uncertainty, love still remained reminding and holding the family together. Not perfectly, but persistently. Kody looked down quietly after hearing Christine's words. And suddenly, he understood something that had taken him years to emotionally accept. Love inside families does not disappear simply because relationships evolved. It changes shape. It adapts. It survives through different versions of people and different phases of life. And maybe the mistake he made for so long was believing love only counted if the family stayed exactly the same. Later that night, after everyone left, Kody remained sitting outside alone once more. But this time, the emotions inside him felt completely different from the sadness and grief he carried weeks earlier. Now, instead of mourning the family's transformation, he found himself appreciating its resilience. Despite everything, the family still came together, still cared, still tried, still chose connection even after disappointment, change, and emotional distance. That realization filled him with unexpected gratitude. Inside the house, Janelle quietly joined him outside after cleaning up. For a while, neither spoke. They simply sat together listening to distant sounds from inside the house and watching the night settle around them. Finally, Kody broke the silence softly. "I think I was so focused on what changed that I stopped seeing what survived." Janelle looked toward him curiously. "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I think maybe surviving change together matters more than avoiding change altogether." The honesty in his voice carried calmness she hadn't heard from him in years. Not denial. Not emotional panic. Acceptance. Janelle nodded slowly. "I think everybody needed this reminder." Kody glanced toward her. "Reminder of what?" "That family isn't something you preserve by freezing it in time," she answered gently. "It survives because people keep choosing each other through every new phase." The words settled deeply between them. Because over the last several weeks, that was exactly what everyone had slowly started doing again.